And today, Sunday, the 8th day of Tammuz, corresponding to the 14th day of July. Today's class graciously dedicated by Mr. Jorge Lichi and family, Le'ilui Nishmat, his mother-in-law, Mazal Bat Jamile, Alea Shalom. Additionally, by Jose and Carolina Safra, Le'ilui Nishmat, his beloved father, Adolfo Obadiah ben Bahie, and his uncle, Coco Yaakov ben Bahie, alav shalom. Additionally, by Victor Mizrahi from Mexico, Le'ilui Nishmat, his beloved father, Eliyahu ben Lela, alav shalom. Additionally, today's class dedicated Le'ilui Nishmat, Mrs. Lily Safra, Leah bat Hana, aleh shalom, and Refuah Shelema of Tzipora bat Marinel, Rivka bat Sara, among the Holim of all of Am Israel as well. Today's class will discuss, number one, a very fascinating concept that we learn over Shabbat about the parasha of yesterday. And I think that is imperative for me to say it today because it doesn't need to wait till Shabbat, like occasionally some message do happen, because actually the message or two that Hashem will share with the Kahal is relevant to everyday life. So everybody remembers that yesterday the Torah talks about, after one of the complaints of the Jewish people, and we know that this parasha that we read yesterday had a couple of hiccups for Am Israel. The pasuk tells us that Moshe Rabbeinu, or rather Kadosh Baruch Hu, sent the snakes, so to speak, and literally there were many casualties of Am Israel. That's what the pasuk writes. What is the reaction of the Jewish people when they see Hakadosh Baruch Hu sending them a message through the snakes? They come to Moshe and they said, Hatanu. They recognize that they made the avon against him and against Hakadosh Baruch Hu. Hitpalel el Hashem. Pray to the Almighty. So Hashem removes the snakes. Hashem says to Moshe, Aseh lecha saraf besim oto al nes. Basically, Moshe Rabbeinu is told by God, create like the format, like the image of a snake, and put it basically on top, high in a pole. Behaya kol hanashuch bera'a oto b'hai. Whoever was beaten saw the snake and remained alive. And Moshe Rabbeinu does exactly as Hashem tells him, with one difference. That what material did Moshe Rabbeinu utilize to make this snake image? Nehoshet, copper. Why nehoshet? Because nahash means snake, nehoshet means copper. The root letters of the word copper in Hebrew are snake. And the pasuk writes, Behaya, and it will be when someone was beaten by the snake, look at the snake and remain alive. And there are a few questions here. Why was there a need? If the whole purpose was look at the image of the snake and then you will be able to remain alive, why was there a need to put it on a pole? And why specifically the snake? By the way, in the world, the medical symbol is a snake, which, by the way, it came from yesterday's parasha. Now, the question is, what's the relationship between the snake and healing? One answer could be that the snake has the power to kill, but the antidote of the poison of the snake comes from the actual snake. That's how you save people's life. If they need to do an antidote, where do they get it from? From the venom. You have the snake that gives you the venom, and the snake gives you the antidote. Okay, that answers why the world utilizes the snake symbol for healing. And that's why the snake symbol, how is it? I'm not a graphic designer, but I believe that there is a pole and then there is like this, right? Right, that's a symbol. So this snake is the snake of yesterday's parasha, Nehash HaNehoshet, and the pole is what Hashem said to Moshe, put it up high so everybody looked at it. Now we learn in the Be'era parasha a very fascinating concept that explains that the reason why people needed to look up to this pole, it wasn't really to look at the snake. It was really to look what's behind the snake. Let's say if I take this pole and I put it in the window, automatically by default, when you lift up your head, what are you going to see behind the pole, behind the snake? The heavens. You see the sender of the snake. Who is the sender of the snake? HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Doesn't the Gemara tells a story about a certain reptile that used to come out from the hole when the people were going to pray, and they informed Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa, and he says, next time he comes out, let me know. What does he do? He comes out and he puts the heel of his feet into the hole, and then the snake died. And he said to them, Lo anahash memit, elaham het memit. It says, you think that the snake is the one that kills? The sin causes the snake to become activated in a poisonous manner. Now, why specifically the snake? Because the snake was the one who was the first creation in the world that spoke in an ill manner. And that's the reason the punishment of the snake is what? Al gehoncha telech. You will crawl basically on your stomach and you will eat. Thank you so much. Thank you. And you will eat from the dust. From the dust. From here, the lesson is also learn the concept of governments. The concept of governments. You know, obviously everybody is concerned about what happened yesterday to President or former president or honorable president, that's the proper word, okay? Trump. Very concerning and very scary. And Baruch Hashem, that there was not major amount of casualties. There were only 2 casualties, I believe, the shooter and a victim, unfortunately, but irrelevant of the amount, is very concerning and very worrisome that this is what are we up to. So we hope and pray, and the reason why do I bring this, because this perush of the snake of yesterday's parasha is attached to the concept of government. The Mishnah writes in the Pirkei Avot, Heve mitpalel bishloma shel malchut. Pray for the welfare of the government, meaning for the stability. But why do we need to pray for their stability? The Mishnah tells us a reason. Shilmale mora'a ish et re'eo hayim bela'o. That if people will not be afraid of the law of the land, people will kill each other. That's what happened prior to the Mabul. What was the biggest crime that society committed? Crime. Besides immorality, there was crime. You know, somebody showed me a sign the other day that in California, they advise the thieves, the criminals, don't steal more than $950. Otherwise, we will have to prosecute you. Yani they telling them, okay, you're allowed to steal. You know, can you imagine? You want deodorant, You have to call customer service. You got to call a salesperson. You want to buy diapers, etc. This is the society that we live in, and it's very concerning because these were the type of sins that prompted the Mabul in the time prior to Noah. But also, also, the Pirush explains that many times people complain against the governments. People complain. This government is doing this government is doing that. It says no government can do anything unless it's pre-approved in Shemaim. Not only our life, to a certain extent, has a connectivity to Shemaim, which obviously does, but even the concept of the government is connected to the Shemaim protocol. So if we want the government, so to speak, whatever government it is, somebody told me on Erev Shabbat, oh yeah, in Mexico, now they're having the new president is going to be a Jewish lady. It's not a reason to celebrate. Don't celebrate. Why? Because we don't know if it's going to be good or not good. Besides her background, and maybe to a goy, I was told, and not from the not more on the leftist part of politics, but I'm not a politician, so I don't know really what is the bottom line. But the bottom line from yesterday's parasha says, not only pray for the government, but our behavior, and this is the key message from the parasha, our behavior as Yehudim, it has an influence of how the government functions, which is very scary. You know, when the Goyim say the Jewish people control the politicians, they don't even know what they are saying. They are saying it from an anti-Semitic perspective. But according to yesterday's parasha, our actions as Yehudim have a good influence in the entire society. It's like the second message of the parasha. The pasuk writes that an interesting pasuk. The pasuk says, "Bechol keli patuach asher en samid patil alav tameh hu." What does this pasuk means? This pasuk refers to tum'at ohel. Tum'at ohel means that if God forbid there was a dead body in a room, whatever is exposed in that room, by default, the fact that the air becomes contaminated with the impurity of human remains, everything in that room becomes impure. Let's say you have a cup of coffee open in the room, you cannot drink it. You have to get rid of it. Why? Because the open cup of coffee absorbs the contamination of the air. It's all spiritual. And the pasuk suddenly says, and a vessel, right here, let me find it, and a vessel that is not sealed, meaning a vessel, let's make the example here, that is open, tameh. Our rabbis tell us, thank you so much, that although this pasuk talks about the vessel, and Rashi explains that the Torah is talking about a vessel made of earthenware, and the reason why, because earthenware, if it's sealed, does not receive the tum'ah, but if it's open, absorbs the tum'ah. Our rabbis tell us that this is referring to the mouth of the person. Says, if your mouth, keli patuach, your mouth is free for all. You say whatever you want. No filters, no anesthesia, no nice words. You just open and you are a sewer, so to speak. Asher en samid patil alav, and you don't have a cover in your mouth, meaning you don't have a filter, you don't choose the proper words to say, you just speak heke, you speak because it's free. Tamehu. It demonstrates that this person has a lot to do in the spiritual life. The literal meaning of the word tamehu means that person is impure. It's not a good person. That's basically what it means. But if we fast forward to the concept of God tells to Moshe, yesterday's parasha talked about the passing of Miriam and Aharon Kohen, both tzaddikim. Now comes the pasuk, and God says to Moshe, "Kach et hamate, take the staff and gather the Jewish people, you and Aharon, vedibartem el asela le'enehem, and speak to the rock in front of them. Benatan memav, and the rock will give you water. Beoseta lahem mai min asela, and you will bring out water from the rock. Beishkita et ha'edah ve'et ve'iram, and you will be able to provide water for the nation and for the flock." Now, why did HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Moshe, speak to the rock? I think the answer comes from the Rambam. The Rambam discusses in the laws of Tum'at Sara'at the avon of Lashon Hara. Now, many times people say, I'm only saying, I'm not doing. What's the big deal? I just said something. The parasha, God, it says in the Bera parasha, wants to teach Moshe Rabbeinu a lesson for the Jewish people to learn. What was the lesson that God wants to teach the Jewish people? Look, Moshe Rabbeinu spoke to the rock and water came out. So don't think that speaking does not create a reaction. But regretfully, when Moshe Rabbeinu spoke to the rock, what happened? Nothing came out. Maybe he did not speak to the right rock. And then the Moshe Rabbeinu says, and the problem here, and the Torah is perfect. When the Torah writes words, they are not written like that. In the pasuk of this incident, it tells us what happened with Moshe. Vayakhilu Moshe beHaron et ha'am. Moshe Rabbeinu literally gathers the nation in front of the stone. Vayomer lahem, and he says to them, Shim'ona hamorim, haminasela hazeh nosi lachem maim. Here is, and I'm not comfortable to say what I need to say, but due to my limited knowledge, I have to say what I'm going to say. Here is, kaviyachol, so to speak, what happened with Moshe. We know the outcome of this, Chaim Tovim, of this incident. What was the outcome? That Hashem says to Moshe, you're not going to Israel. You're staying back. Why? For one hiccup that Moshe Rabbeinu had? We need to understand what prompted the hiccup. Moshe Rabbeinu speaks to the Jewish people in a very derogatory way. He says to the Jewish people, Shim'ona hamorim, someone who doesn't understand much and doesn't know Hebrew grammar will not see a problem with this sentence. Because if I speak to you in Hebrew, Shim'ona hamorim, what do you understand? Huh? Teachers, listen please, teachers. That's what this sounds like. But no. The morim with vav means teachers. Morim without Vav, it's from Lashon Mored, rebels. Sarbanim, troublemakers. Moshe says to the Jewish people, troublemakers, you want to see water from this rock? So when Moshe Rabbeinu speaks in this way, two things happened. Number one, speaking in a negative way against the Jewish people. And number two, he was angry. And what the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot says, if you're a Chacham, if you're a wise man, your wisdom leaves you. If you're a prophet, prophecy leaves you. Even though you may say, of course, Moshe Rabbeinu was fed up yesterday. How many complaints alone we had in yesterday's parasha? You complain about the man, you complain about the water, you complain about the free food that the Egyptian used to give us. 10 times we complain. And Moshe Rabbeinu says, enough. What do you want from me? You wanted manna? Here is manna. Manna has no side effects. Manna is all pure, godly, and healthy. But you complain. The water, you complain. God provided you 40 years water in the desert. You think he's going to give you water tomorrow? So we can justify, emotionally perhaps, why Moshe Rabbeinu was a bit unhappy with the actions and the comments of the Jewish people. But God says to Moshe, Ya'an asher lo ha'emantem bi, your actions, it really set me back with the Jewish people, because this was a golden opportunity to teach the Jewish people that the words are not empty. The words have value. The words carry more weight than people think. He had an opportunity to teach people how when a person speaks, it creates a force. Sometimes it's positive, sometimes it's negative. And then, instead of bringing Kiddush Hashem, it brought the opposite. And that's why the Pasuk calls it Me Meriba, the water of the fire, of the fighting. Meriba is from fighting. And there is an explanation why it specifically talks about Meriba, but in plain English, basically this was a place for trouble for the Jewish people. And it says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu medagdek im sadikav kehuta se'ara. Borei Olam, why? Somebody asked yesterday this after the class. With all the good that Moshe Rabbeinu did, couldn't God close his eyes and move on? The answer is no. You know why? Because one of the ways that Hashem's name is sanctified is when the righteous make mistakes, which we all do. And I'm not saying that I'm righteous, but Shlomo Melech says, En sadik ba'aretz asher ya'aseh tov belo yeheta. Even righteous tzaddikim, they have shortcomings. For example, I'll tell you one example. The example of Sara Imenu. When was the whole dispute in the house of Abraham, Sara, and Hagar mistreated Sarah and talked to her in a disrespectful way, Hagar, Mehila, Sarah, and Abraham had Shalom Bayit issues. They were arguing. So one day, Sarah says to Abraham, listen to the words. Ishpot Hashem beni ubenecha. I'm summoning God to determine who is right and who is wrong. What was God's answer to them when he was summoned to become the mediator in Shalom Bayit feud? God says to Abraham, whatever Sarah tells you, listen. She's right. But do you know what happened after this? Sarah's life was shortened 38 years because he summoned God in judgment. And when you summon God in judgment, there is no negotiation, there is no settlement, there is no gray, either guilty or innocent. That's why we learn from that pasuk in Sefer Bereshit that a person should never invoke God's involvement. If it's for something good, let's say somebody did something good to you, and you say to the person, may God take care of you in a good, positive way, that's a beracha. But you know how many times I deal with people, and in the moment of anger, they tell me, que Dios se ocupe de él, que Dios te lo pague. You know what that means? In Spanish, if it's in a negative connotation, that is dangerous to say. And on the spot, I'm able to determine based on the conversation. Sometimes people say this with anger. I said, remove these words from your mouth. Hit your mouth. Say, no, God, don't get involved. You know why? The Gemara in Makot says, Yesh din lemata en din lemala. If people try to settle their dispute and differences in this world among people, good, bad, mediocre, settlement, understanding, forgiveness, Shamayim says, okay, you guys are taking care of it, I don't get involved. But the moment that we invoke heavenly assistance against another person, the consequences could be disastrous to both parties involved. Not only for the person that you are activating judgment against, but we also carry liability for activating judgment against another person. That's what happened with Sarah. And that's what happened with Yaakov. And that's what happened with Moshe Rabbeinu. And Aaron. But Aaron was different than Moshe. But both of them pay the price. Even Miriam, when Miriam spoke about the wife of Moshe, remember 2 weeks ago? Why was she punished? I could have said, no, haram. She saved Moshe Rabbeinu. Who saved Moshe Rabbeinu? Who watched over Moshe Rabbeinu? Look in the beginning of Sefer Shemot. ותתסב אחותו מרחוק לדעה מה יעשה לו. Who was watching? Who instrumented and orchestrated that Moshe Rabbeinu was going to be nursed by his own mother and took care of him? Miriam. That's the reason when Miriam was punished with leprosy 2 weeks ago, what the Pasuk says, the Jewish people waited for Miriam. Why they waited for Miriam? Because God says 80 years ago, more actually, you waited for your brother a few minutes. Now I'm going to cash in your waiting card. When Moshe Rabbeinu, God summons Moshe in the beginning of Sefer Shemot, I want you to be the one who leads the Jewish people. What was Moshe Rabbeinu's questions to God? What if they don't believe in me? Ribono shel Olam. Is like you planning a wedding 6 months from now, 3 months from now, and you want to do it on a Sunday, and right away you ask, what if it rains that day? Don't open your mouth. But that was what happened with Moshe. Moshe says, what if the Jewish people don't believe in me? You know what God says to Moshe? Okay, you have a hand? Yes. Put your hand inside of your coat. Bring the hand out. What happened with the hand of Moshe? Was punished with leprosy. Why? Because you spoke Lashon Hara against the Jewish people. And Moshe Rabbeinu, by the way, Let me clarify to the entire audience in the room and Torah and later on listeners that God forbid that Moshe Rabbeinu's intention was to speak ill against the Jewish people. Moshe Rabbeinu is coming to God with you want to make a deal, right? And when you prepare yourself to meet this fellow on the other side of the table, whatever you want to call him, the buyer, the investor, the factory, etc. In your mind, you do your homework and you are ready for different scenarios, correct? Don't you do that? Okay, what if he doesn't want to pay full price? Okay, you start negotiating. Yani you have some flexibility. So Moshe Rabbeinu's question to God is definitely pure innocence. In other words, Moshe Rabbeinu is asking God, God, you're telling me to take the staff, throw it on the ground, and it's going to become a snake. Or take the water, it's going to become blood. And what if they don't believe me? What's my alternative? What else can I do for them? God says to Moshe, a Yehudi, when you're talking about, we're not talking about business now, because in business you need to do this homework. But when you're talking about the salvation of the entire Jewish nation, you cannot afford to assume the worst. The Gemara writes, actually it's a Midrash Rabbah brought down by the Hatam Sofer, that if Moshe Rabbeinu will have entered Eretz Israel, the Jewish people will have never been involved in idolatry and will have never the Bet HaMikdash number one being ever being destroyed. But, and this is related to this week's Torah portion, Perashat Balak. We all know the storyline of Balak. We're not going to go through it today. We'll wait for later on in the week. But I'd like just to pay attention to the end of the Perashah. The end of this week's Torah portion talks about a very unfortunate tragedy that affected the Jewish people, correct? When they became involved with the sin of immorality with the daughters of Moab. And the Torah tells us the location of the sin. The Pasuk writes that the Jewish people were in a place called Shittim, and they became involved to the Avodah Zarah, the idolatry, known Baal Peor. This is where the location took a place at the end of this week's Torah portion. Fast forward, Perashat Bezot HaBeracha, the last Perashah of the Sefer Torah. The Pasuk there says at the end, Vayikbor oto Bagai mul Bet Peor. Moshe Rabbeinu was buried in a place called Gai, across from Peor, from this week's Torah portion. And Rabbi Moshe Cordovero explains that what kind of location is Gai? What location is Gai? If you put in Google Maps, put the word Gai across from Baal Peor. Guaranteed it will say location not found. Location not found. It's not found. Nowhere in the map is found. But the Pasuk says, Vayikbor oto Bagai mul Bet Peor. So I'll tell you 1 second. I'll tell you one thing. First, this was outside of Eretz Israel. That's easy to understand. Number 2, Rabbi Moshe Cordovero writes that Gai, if you reverse the letters, is Yod Gimal. Yod Gimal Midot HaRachamim, the 13 attributes of mercy. Across from Bet Peor, it says in the Zohar Kadosh that every time the sin of Peor wants to become activated to accuse the Jewish people, the presence of Moshe Rabbeinu in that area mitigates the judgment against the Jewish people. If you want to know more details about this, the Ben Ish Chai talks about, and I'm going to say it now because this is something that we do every day of our life. And if you don't do this, go see a doctor. Going to the bathroom. Going to the bathroom, says the Ben Ish Chai, and I'm not going to be too graphic because everybody is having a nice breakfast, but says the Ben Ish Chai, thank you so much, that every time a person goes to the restroom, number two especially, is, and we wash our hands and we say Asher Yatzar, we are repairing the sin of Baal Peor of this week's Torah portion. Every time. Why? Because the idolatry of Peor, which is the name of that part of the body, was related to going to the restroom. The idolatry was to believe yourself in front of the idol. And the Jewish people went with that. Why? Because they figure which idolatry, it's honoring their idol by relieving yourself. So they figure that it's not a sin because it's crazy, it's abnormal. But because that's how you do that idolatry, that is considered the sin of idolatry. And that brought immorality. And eventually the 24,000 casualties that are mentioned in the parasha. So he says the Ben Ish Chai that every time a person goes to the restroom, washes the hands, and says Asher Yatzar, we are remedying the sin committed in this week's Torah portion at the end of the parasha. I think that for today, we're going to say Dayenu. We cover valuable classes. I repeat them very quickly. Lessons. Number one, the topic of, we discuss which one we discuss first. We discuss the topic of the snake and knowing that it comes from the Almighty. We also discuss about praying for the welfare of the government and the animals, and anything that happens in life, it has a sender. The same one that gives your life, your health, our life, our health, our family, our livelihood, is the same sender of the challenges and headaches throughout life. Number one. Number two, we discuss the importance of having a clean mouth, not to be open, free for all. Even though many times people say freedom of speech, we don't have freedom of speech according to the Torah, because if the speech will be utilized with a tremendous amount of freedom, so then our life will be hindered by more sins of vulgarity, profanity, lashon hara, rechilut, etc. Moshe Rabbeinu's anger, justified so. But yet the Torah teaches us, even though in your mind is justified, that action, it was a missed opportunity to sanctify God's names in front of the entire nation. Let me ask you a question. How many people fit in this room? Standing. I remember the good old days when I started here. You remember, we used to have the stand-up kiddush on Shabbat here. How many people were fitting into this room? Maybe over 100. Standing. No chairs. Baruch Hashem, through the years, the room became too small, and we do it outside, 300 people. Baruch Hashem. Now let me ask you a question. Can you imagine in the area where the rock was, the entire Jewish people was standing in front of it? We don't understand. We don't understand. The entire Jewish nation standing in front of the rock. This was a golden opportunity to teach a lesson to the Jewish people on the power of talking. That opportunity was missed. And God says the following halacha. There is a halacha that it says as follows: Binkom Hilul Hashem en holkin kavod larav. In English means, when there is desecration of God's names, there is no respect for the rabbi. What does it mean there is no respect for the rabbi? If God's names is being defiled, you need to act. You can't say, I'm going to let the rabbi do it. We need to act. Why? Because, God forbid, the sin of desecrating God's names doesn't have a patience element. Since, we were learning yesterday in the Gemara, sins depends on which type of sin. God says, I'll wait. I'll wait till you repent. I wait till you do teshuvah. I wait a bit. I wait. And depends on the sin, depends on the condition, the level of tolerance. One sin that does not have that level of tolerance is desecrating God's names. Kol Hilul Hashem. And yet, that's the Torah says, Yan lo hemantem bi lehagdisheni. It literally means, because you did not believe in me to sanctify my name. Can you imagine God telling Moshe, because of you, we cannot sanctify the name? And that's why the Halacha writes that a person, I will finish with this. There is a commandment from the Torah that says, Benigdashti betoch bnei Israel. I will sanctify myself among the Jewish people. What does it mean, I will sanctify my name among the Jewish people? Many people erroneously think that Kiddush Hashem is when you do something to Goim. Maybe there is something, but that's not really the Kiddush Hashem. The Kiddush Hashem from the Torah perspective is among us. Example, when we don't talk during Kaddish, when we answer Kedusha, Nagdishach bena'arisach, Keter itenu lecha, Kadosh, 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 when we say the Kaddish, these are moments that we are sanctifying Hashem's name. Okay, my good friends? I wish everybody a Shabbat Tov Mevorach. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen ve'amen. Rabbi Hanania ben Akashia Omer. רצה הקדוש ברוך הוא